On today's show, we will go through all 32 NFL offenses and put them into tiers based on what actually matters for fantasy: play volume, weather, concentration of touches, coaching, offensive line play, basically the stuff outside or mostly outside of player talent that drives fantasy points, the scoring environment. Of course, please, before you go into the comments and say how dumb we are, please understand this is not about quarterback play. This is not about talent. This is not about who we think the best fantasy players are. This is about ranking offensive environments for 2025. We'll start with the Arizona Cardinals. Big thing to me on the Cardinals is Drew Petzing and the offensive coordinator stuff. The way he used Marvin Harrison last year was so concerning to me, and frankly, what I thought was so bad. It gives me bad vibes for just his overall ability to scheme to all players in his offense. So to me, we have OC faith on Drew Petzing 20th out of 32. I'm even maybe a little bit more worried than that personally. Mark, go ahead on Arizona Cardinal offensive environment thoughts.
Certainly limited faith in Drew Petzing as well there. I think the Marvin Harrison note is a key one. And then also looking at this offense, Brandon Thorne has them 31st overall in offensive line rankings. And when you have questions around the offensive coordinator and then weak expected offensive line play, that doesn't lead to necessarily a great overall fantasy environment. So those are kind of the negatives. Positive for the fantasy environment here right away is we do expect the targets to be highly condensed on Trey McBride here, as well as Marvin Harrison Jr. and then Michael Wilson locked in as a wide receiver 2 here. And when James Conner is healthy, we know the touches are going his way as well. So in terms of concentration here of targets and opportunities, the Cardinals, are a little bit higher there. And then they also play in a dome. They have great weather all season, and they have an NFL high 13 games indoors this season. So that lands Arizona kind of right in the middle of the pack here, 16th, tier 3 for us, that solid tier there for the Cardinals. So, certainly some warts with Drew Petzing in the offensive line, but also some positives we can latch on to. And I think the Arizona team is, fairly in the middle of the pack here.
Yeah, we have them ranked number 1, best for weather. As Mark said, 13 dome games this year for the Arizona Cardinals certainly makes a difference. So yes, 3rd tier here for us, solid in the tier sheet for those watching on the YouTubes. Jack, let's go to the Atlanta Falcons here next up. Certainly solid in terms of weather and schedule once again. Offensive line play actually looks good as well. I feel like people are going to be a bit surprised perhaps by where we end up here on tier for Falcons offensive environment. Go ahead on what you found with them.
Yeah, I think people are going to be a little bit surprised by this, but we have Atlanta actually as the number 1 team when we were doing this. They're just really solid across the board. They were 6th in plays per game last year. We have them being ahead of the pack in pace. Again, they have a solid offensive line, according to Brandon Thorne. The whole NFC South just has really nice schedules this year, both from a weather standpoint. Obviously, Atlanta plays in the dome as well as who they play, and they get the soft defenses of the NFC South. Like the Bucs, we saw 2 shootout games with the Bucs and the Falcons last year, and then they get the Panthers and the Saints as well. 2 nice matchups. And then from a volume concentration standpoint, Kyle Pitts did share some time with Charlie Werner last year. He wasn't always on the field for rundowns especially, but he was out there for pass downs. And then the wide receiver snaps are really concentrated. Ray McLeod played at least 91% of snaps in at least half of the Falcons games last year. And Ray McLeod is not like some stud NFL wide receiver, obviously, but Zach Robinson really honed in on his 3 wide receivers in London, Darnell Mooney, and McLeod last year. And then Bijan Robinson obviously dominated RB touches with Algier behind him getting some work. So we had Atlanta just really solid across the board. They were not higher than 4th in any individual category, but that steadiness across the board landed them 1st overall.
Yeah, I mean, and you see why the offensive coordinator stuff matters, right? On OC faith now, we have 17 for Atlanta, 17th rank, which isn't great, but it's better than the Arthur Smith stuff where we saw Bijan Robinson rotating a ton. You saw the usage that Bijan Robinson got in the first year after Arthur Smith left. And just to reiterate the categories that we're looking at here: pace, schedule/weather, concentration of usage, offensive coordinator faith, offensive line. Those are the categories that we ranked in to get to the final rank here. And yes, The Atlanta Falcons check in at number 1 overall for offensive environment in 2025. Baltimore Ravens, of course, on talent, Ravens have one of the best teams in the league, but you're going to run into weather issues. You're going to run into some schedule issues, and certainly not the fastest team in the league either. What do you think about Ravens' offensive environment?
A consistent theme as we talk through the AFC North teams are that they have a tough weather schedule and just a hard schedule in general, as the AFC North is one of the toughest divisions in the NFL and typically all play in poor weather cities come the winter. But I think here with Baltimore, you have Todd Monken, I think solidified himself as a top 10 offensive coordinator last season, just a highly efficient offense there, obviously led by Lamar Jackson. I think when we look at volume of concentration of targets here, it's a little tricky because they did add DeAndre Hopkins in the offseason. And last year, they're also running 2 tight end sets frequently with, Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. They also have Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman still there. And then obviously Derrick Henry, the big dog in the backfield. So there's a lot of offensive talent here in Baltimore. They land, pretty much in the top half in tier 2 for us, 12th overall. So still, a very solid offensive environment overall here for Baltimore. The weather and the schedule, again, dragging them down a little bit here. But, we know the Ravens are going to have a very strong, highly efficient offense. It's just, I think, a bit more question of where exactly those targets and touchdowns are coming from for the Ravens.
Yeah, I mean, ton of faith for me in Todd Monken, formerly returned as Todd MF and Monken. Really, really like what he did last year for the Ravens. And you saw the environment last year when Lamar Jackson plays at that level. He obviously drags a lot of guys along with him and creates a really good environment as well. The Buffalo Bills, Jack, I think people might be a bit surprised by where this team lands because people are so obsessed with the offensive environment. But some things that we run into in DFS in terms of concentration, where the touchdown is going to go, that can be troublesome for Bill stuff in DFS and maybe in season long as well. What do you think about Bill stuff?
Yeah, I think with the Ravens and the Bills, it's important to remember that we're trying to evaluate the environment, not the actual team. So this is not the best fantasy offenses. It's kind of ignoring the fact that they have Lamar and Josh Allen, and saying how good is this team if they didn't have that much talent. And the Bills are worse than our rankings for weather. Obviously, playing in Buffalo in November and December is not optimal. And then for concentration, last year they played 3 running backs, 2 tight ends, 4 or 5 wide receivers at times. So they rank really low in that category as well. They do have one of the best offensive lines in the league, which drags them up quite a bit. And then we do have a decent amount of faith in Joe Brady. We have him 13th in our offensive coordinator rankings. But on the whole, given the weather concerns, given the volume concentration concerns, Buffalo lands pretty in the middle of the pack. We have them 17th in our final rank. That would be tier 3.
Yeah, I mean, even when Joe Brady had Stephon Diggs, he wasn't like, man, I'm going to jam the ball to Stephon Diggs. And he certainly has shown no inclination to do it at the running back position either, where James Cook, I thought, had really good year last year and still was under 50% of the snaps. Ty Johnson is, of course, back, as is Ray Davis. And you're going to get, I think, pretty flat target shares again across the board at the pass catcher position. So, yeah, another solid, not great, not elite, but certainly not dusty or ugh, God forbid, ugh, for the Bills. Carolina Panthers here. Good news is they get to play in the AFC South, which is going to create a pretty good schedule generally in terms of scoring environments. A lot of question marks elsewhere, though. Mark, what do you think about the Carolina Panthers?
Yeah, we can start with the good here. I think soft schedule there in the NFC South, and then solid offensive coordinator faith here are the top things going for Carolina. Concentration is a little tricky here. Certainly, we expect a lot of targets to go to Ted McMillan, their first round pick this season, but then they do have 4 overall, wide receivers that could all get targets, in Adam Thielen, Xavier Legette, and Jalen Coker. We also have a tight end battle here with Jatavion Sanders and Tommy Tremble. They split routes pretty evenly when both were healthy last year. And then we also got some more competition in the backfield here as Rico Dowdle was added in the offseason to potentially take away some touches from Chuba Hubbard here. So while there are some things going for Carolina, it's not necessarily a smash here. They do have a pretty poor offensive line, ranked 20th overall. And then the concentration of volume there mentioned as well is a wart for them. And they were also a pretty slow-paced team last year, did not get off very many plays at all. And we are expecting kind of a similar trend this year. They're expected to have a really poor defense once again this season. So that could, their defense could be on the field quite a bit, limiting the amount of offensive plays and pace their offense is able to run with this year. So Carolina is going to be our first team here in tier 4. They are 23rd overall for us are the Carolina Panthers.
Yeah, one thing that we didn't put into this exercise is defense. And so one dynamic that certainly is we've seen with the Lions and like the Coors Field of DFS stuff and the Panthers at times last year is like when you get down 21-7 or your defense is giving up huge plays, bombs, that can be good for the offense at times. And so that's not in this, but creating shootouts, like I'm thinking back to those Bucks Panthers games last year where no one could stop either one. And obviously that leads to some massive scoring output. So I could see the Panthers maybe being a little bit better than this just on that fact, but generally speaking, agree with the meh tier here for the Panthers. Chicago Bears, well, they get Ben Johnson. We have them 7th in OC faith. They upgrade the offensive line massively this offseason. We have them 7th also in offensive line ranking. Jack, a lot of optimism around the Bears these days. What do you think about the offensive environment?
Yeah, I mean, getting Ben Johnson's a big deal. Like you said, we have Chicago 7th in OC faith. We also have them 7th in pace. Detroit ranked top 3 in the league in plays per game in each of the past 2 years. A big part of that was that they were just so good offensively that they could sustain drives, but they were also middle of the pack in pace. So if we expect the Bears offense to take a step forward and Ben Johnson to maintain his same pace that he had in Detroit, they could easily be an above average pace team. They do get knocked on both schedule and weather. They face a tough schedule in the NFC North, and then Chicago in the wintertime, as I'm well aware of, is not an ideal place to play football. And then the big thing that's going to be a big talking point throughout the offseason and into the season for the rookies especially will be the volume concentration. DJ Moore and Rome Odunze are pretty locked into roles on the outside, but Colston Loveland, Cole Kmet, Luther Burden, and even Olamide Zaccheaus are going to be fighting for snaps, routes, and targets early in the year. Burden and Loveland have both been dealing with injuries through minicamp and OTAs that have kept them off the field. They're probably going to be ready for training camp, but missing those kinds of reps for a rookie at this point in the offseason is not ideal, and they do have veterans like Kmet and Zaccheaus who could push for snaps early in the year. And then running back is kind of a mess. We don't know, are they going to add someone still? The current room of DeAndre Swift, Roshan Johnson, and Kyle Monangai is not super inspiring. There's not a ton left on the free agency market. We'll see if someone gets cut in August and they add someone late, or if they make a move for someone. But volume concentration and the schedule and weather is kind of why we have Chicago down slightly above average at 13th overall at the bottom of tier 2.
Bottom of tier 2. Yeah, to me, the concentration is the big question, as Jack alluded to here. You draft Colston Loveland at 10th overall, even though you just gave Cole Kmet a pretty big contract. You draft Luther Burden at the top of round 2, even though you have Rome Odunze, DJ Moore, and Zaccheaus. So, yeah, and obviously the running back situation, I agree, is a bit messy. So that's the biggest thing to me. But other than that, Bears have done a lot to improve their offensive environment this offseason. Cincinnati Bengals. Well, we get the weather thing again here, Mark, but my God, when Joe Burrow hits, you know how it's hitting, and there's certainly a lot of value in that in DFS and, frankly, in season long as well. What do you think about the Cincinnati Bengals?
Yeah, it's kind of funny charting out the Bengals here and their strengths and weaknesses in this exercise. Pretty much their biggest strength is the concentration of targets and volume here. Obviously, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and then we also got Chase Brown in the backfield. They should see a vast majority of the offensive touches here for the Bengals, which is great in fantasy. But kind of when you look at the rest of the environment, it's not as rosy. The offensive line for the Bengals checks in at 27th right now. We know that's been a consistent bugaboo for them in Joe Burrow's career. It should be once again this season. Also, Zach Taylor, I think, is more of a middling offensive coordinator. Certainly, not great, not bad necessarily, but not someone that we're certainly inspired by. I think Joe Burrow and the wide receiver firepower there kind of gets the credit for how strong this offense is. So we have Zach Taylor, middle of the pack. And then, yeah, the weather here, again, playing in the AFC North kind of dings Cincinnati a little bit. So outside of the strong concentration here, not much to latch onto with the Bengals. They land squarely in tier 3 for us 19th overall for Cincinnati.
Yeah, and people probably think that that's really low for the Bengals. This team can score a lot of points. That's certainly it, but a lot of that is just predicated on straight talent, right? The environment may not be that great, but my gosh, they have so much talent on the offensive side of the ball. And going back to that dynamic I talked about with the Panthers, Bengals defense could be really bad, again, causing Joe Burrow to have a ton of attempts here, which is obviously good for fantasy. The Cleveland Browns, implied to score the fewest points in the entire NFL this season. Jack, is the offensive environment that bad?
It's not great. We'll start with the good though. We do have them third in pace. They ranked third in plays per game last year, despite being the lowest scoring offense in football, which is really impressive just from the fact that they couldn't sustain drives, that they ran so many plays. In 2023, 2 years ago, they led the NFL in plays per game. So if they had the talent, I think Kevin Stefanski wants to play fast. And speaking of Stefanski, we have them 12th in offensive coordinator faith. He's a 2-time coach of the year. He doesn't have a whole lot to work with this year, so it's going to test his abilities, but he has shown the ability to engineer a competent offense in the past. Schedule and weather-wise, it's really brutal. We have them 30th in weather, 27th in schedule. Playing against those defenses, minus the Bengals, in the AFC North is not optimal, and then playing football in a wind-exposed Cleveland Stadium late in the year is not ideal either. We have them 21st in offensive line ranking, and then concentration is an interesting one for them because Jerry Jeudy's pretty locked into his wide receiver 1 role. We think Cedric Tillman is locked into the wide receiver 2 role, but beyond that, it's a huge mess. They drafted Harold Fannin, who's going to compete with the wide receiver 3 through 6 group for snaps. And then the running back room is a mess too, with Quinshon Judkins and Dylan Sampson joining Jerome Ford there. So Jeudy is pretty entrenched as the wide receiver 1 there, and we think Tillman and David Njoku have decent pathways to big roles too. But after that, it's a huge mess, which kind of lowers their concentration rating.
Yeah, so we're at 25th overall here on offensive environment for the Browns, back end of the Met tier here for the Browns. I will say, like, in terms of plays per game, I'm way more confident that this team can execute a lot of plays per game if Joe Flacco is the starter. Not that Joe Flacco was great or anything, but more competent than the other guys that they have on the roster as an NFL quarterback. And reports out of OTAs were like, Flacco is clearly the best quarterback on the team. Does that mean he's going to start 17 games? I don't think so, but at least I think he'll be in there for a decent amount and give them some hope. Dallas Cowboys here, Mark. Of course, Brian Schottenheimer taking over the reins of the offense. What do you think about them?
Dallas is an interesting one, and one of the trends while we were doing this is that the offensive coordinator faith, ranking that we were giving out, it's really hard to know where to put these new offensive coordinators for teams. Basically, we just don't really know how things are going to play out. Certainly, there's not a lot of excitement, I would say, around Brian Schottenheimer being named the head coach and offensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys. So that kind of drags them down a little bit. But certainly, if Schottenheimer is able to run a successful offense, then I think Dallas would be a bit higher than we have them here. They come in at 20th in tier 3 for us. So again, kind of middle of the pack here. Offensive line ranked 14th is fine, but not the elite group that we've seen historically from Dallas. They've had some guys leave and retire on that O-line. Dallas, playing at home indoors is certainly favorable. They have 7 of their last 8 games in the fantasy season are also indoors here. And then the concentration of targets, adding George Pickens to the CeeDee Lamb wide receiver duo, as well as having Jake Ferguson at tight end, there is really strong in the pass game, but the concentration takes a big hit when you look at the backfield here with Javonte Williams, Miles Sanders, and Jaden Blue all vying for touches in the backfield there. So I think Dallas could certainly be a team that picks up a little bit here, depending on how the backfield shakes out. But right now in the middle to later part of June, it's hard to really pin down where a lot of the volume in this backfield is going. So Dallas, squarely in tier 3 for us.
Yeah, the way I've been playing Dallas is just, I think they're going to struggle a bit to run the ball, and their strength is in the pass game. And if Dak can stay healthy, I think they're going to throw the ball with a lot of volume and be successful at it. I think George Pickens is my most drafted player so far in best ball, and I feel good about that as of now. So that's kind of the way I've been playing it. I know there's a lot of people out there trying to get the running back thing right between those 3. I've personally been waiting for training camp, and that goes back to the offensive environment stuff where it's really hard to know how how it's going to shake out between Javonte Williams, Miles Sanders, and Jaden Blue. Denver Broncos. I, of course, am a lifelong Broncos fan since roughly last month. The Broncos got really good quarterback play. I think somewhat unexpected to people out of Bo Nix last year. A huge strength of this team is defense, and that's not going to show up here, but they might have the best defense in the entire NFL here for this year. Jack, go ahead on the Denver Broncos.
Yeah, on the good side, the Broncos have a good offensive line, and we can be pretty confident that Sean Payton is going to spearhead a pretty efficient offense. In the middle, we've kind of got pace. They were average pace by most metrics last year. They have an average schedule. They're pretty close to average in terms of where we had them weather-wise. The thing that really drags their ranking down is the volume concentration. Courtland Sutton was an every down wide receiver for them last year. We expect him to be in the same role this year. Evan Ingram should be out there plenty, but the other wide receivers and the running back is pretty up for debate. Last year, they rotated 4 wide receivers. This year, they look like they might do that again with Marvin Mims, Devon Vele, Troy Franklin, and Pat Bryant, not necessarily in that order, but Marvin Mims averaged nearly 10 yards per target last year and didn't have a single regular season game above a 50% snap rate. Even though he was playing so well every week, Sean Payton just refused to give him a full-time role and insisted on giving Troy Franklin and Vele and last year Lil Jordan Humphrey snaps ahead of Mims. And then from a running back standpoint, they drafted RJ Harvey in the second round. He's a super explosive young guy, but they didn't bring in J.K. Dobbins too, so we don't know how that split is gonna figure itself out. So we have them 31st in concentration. The other stuff is all at least average, and when you look at OC faith and O-line, very good. So that in totality lands them 10th, but the volume concentration is pretty rough for them.
Yeah, and so we do have them in tier 2, correct? Tier 2 on the Denver Broncos. The pushback that I would have on Denver Broncos is agreed that Sean Payton is a very good coordinator. This concentration thing scares me. We have them 31st out of 32 teams in concentration, which I think is right. I mean, they rotate so many guys. Sean Payton is notorious for that. And the other aspect of it is what I talked about with the defense. If their defense is as good as I kind of think they're going to be, it's hard to see them getting into a ton of shootouts, which obviously isn't great for the environment. But man, when you have an offensive line as good as the Broncos have, and you have Sean Payton and you have Bo Nix in there, the offensive environment is going to be pretty solid here. And so we do have them, what is that? 10th overall here in the rankings. All right, let's go to a team that a lot of people are going to assume, Mark, that should be number 1 or something close to it in the rankings. That is the Detroit Lions. Go ahead on Lions offensive environment for 2025.
This is another spot that I alluded to earlier where the changing and offensive coordinator kind of, hurts their case a little bit in our rankings here. If Ben Johnson were still here, I think Detroit would pretty easily be number 1 in this category. But changing offensive coordinators here and going to John Morton, who, I wasn't necessarily familiar with before this offseason, I think dings the Lions quite a bit this season. They also have a really difficult schedule. Obviously, we've talked about how strong the NFC North is going to be. And then, as one of the best teams in the NFL last season, they will play a first place schedule and they're out of division games as well. Their plays per game, weather, volume concentration, offensive line, all massive strengths here, keeping them in the top 10. But again, that offensive coordinator ranking is dinging them quite a bit here. We have 28th in our offensive coordinator faith here in John Morton. So if that is, ends up being ridiculously low and Morton is able to carry over what Ben Johnson was able to do, then Detroit would certainly be a tier 1 team. But with that, question mark in hand here for the Lions, we come in at 9th overall, tier 2 for Detroit.
Yeah. And the thing about the John Morton stuff is I'm sure he wants to just copy what Ben Johnson did, right? Like review all the tape, review all the plays, run everything the exact same way. Why mess with what isn't working? Will he actually be able to do that and make adjustments as defense, make adjustments to him, I think is the question. The only thing keeping the Lions out of the elite tier of offensive environments here. Green Bay Packers. Yeah, really weird Green Bay Packers season last year where they dealt with injuries to Jordan Love, got really run heavy through much of the season. Jack, what do you think about offensive environments for Packers in 2025?
Yeah, it's almost a little bit flipped from where we had Detroit in that we have extreme faith in the offensive coordinator or head coach in this case with Matt LaFleur. We had him as a tier 1 offensive coordinator at 5th overall, but everything besides that is kind of rough. They were slow last year. All these NFC North teams, as we've mentioned with Chicago and Detroit, have pretty rough schedules, and they have to play outside, except the Lions, in November and December. So we have Green Bay 26th in schedule and 22nd in weather. They have an average offensive line. And then from a concentration standpoint, we have them 23. We know they want to rotate wide receivers. They added Matthew Golden this offseason, which should keep the wide receivers in a rotation, even with Christian Watson still recovering from the injury. They also drafted Savion Williams on day 2. Luke Musgrave is back this year. Tucker Kraft played so well this year, but you got to think Musgrave is going to play at least a little bit, even though Kraft seems to have won the tight end 1 role. And Josh Jacobs is pretty close to a workhorse, but even at times last year, especially when they would get a lead, we would see the backups get involved, and Marshawn Lloyd is back this year to potentially alleviate some of the load on Josh Jacobs. So we've got them in the bottom half of the league in volume concentration. And Matt LaFleur, our faith in him as an offensive coordinator drags this offensive environment up as a whole, but we still have them 21st in the league in tier 4.
Yes, near the top here of tier 4 for the Green Bay Packers. I could see it going differently this year if they were like, you know what? Last year was a mistake. We ran the ball way too much. Jordan Love is good. Let's just start throwing it. I could see them getting better, but that's a really hard bet to make, kind of on a mean outcome. When reaching for the stars, though, and ceiling outcomes, I kind of think the Packers could be better than people expect in terms of offensive environment, but that's a really hard projection to make here. Again, we have them 20th overall. Let's go to, 21st overall on the Packers. Houston Texans. Well, the good news is that Bobby Slowick is indeed gone here. Mark, what do you think about Texans' offensive environment?
Texans were one of the most surprising teams to me as, we went through this process and how low they ended up for us. I was pretty disappointed because I wanted to be back in on CJ Stroud after, a sophomore slump. And I just love Nico Collins in fantasy, obviously going towards the end of the first round. So I expected us to end up higher on Houston, but that was not the case. Kind of looking through their individual rankings in these categories. Offensive line still a massive concern here for Houston. Obviously, they lose Larry Tunsil, who was the best offensive lineman on a horrible offensive line last year. So they come in at 29th for Brandon Thorne as of June. And then, outside of Nico Collins, just not a ton of faith in where the targets are going to go here. Obviously, they acquired Christian Kirk in the offseason, but they also drafted Jalen Noel to play, potentially vie for that slot role for the Texans as well. And then they had Higgins on the outside here for Houston. Dalton Schultz at tight end, started to get caught up by Cade Stover towards the end of last year. And then Houston also drafted Woody Marks to compete with Joe Mixon in the backfield here. So, while we have a lot of faith in Nico Collins, just the rest of the volume distribution, not ideal for the Texans. And then OC faith, again, hard here with a new face. I want to be optimistic in Nick Caley coming from the Rams system, McVay tree guy. Maybe that does help in multiple facets. Maybe that helps them run more 11 personnel and helps the concentration of volume here get to 3 wide receivers a bit more. But, overall, just as the years go on, I want to be optimistic on these new offensive coordinators, but it's hard. It's hard to get too excited. I don't want to get, out over my skis on these guys coming into brand new situations. He wasn't even with the Texans last year. So with a tough offensive line here and lack of volume concentration, they also have a pretty tough schedule here, finishing first place in the AFC South last year. They have a tough draw once again. So the Texans come in at 28th, tier 5 for us.
In the dusty tier, the first team in the dusty tier is the Texans. And yeah, I'd be lying if I said I knew a lot about Nick Caley. When guys come from McVay, I tend to be optimistic, but obviously that's a projection with how well he does here. I was optimistic on Bobby Slowick when he took over the job too, like a young analytics guy, and he just could not get it right. On the offensive line stuff, again, as Mark noted, Thorne has them 29th out of 32 teams in offensive line play. A lot of the blame for what happened last year to CJ Stroud was on offensive line. The bet they are making this year is not that they are more talented, right? I don't think anybody would say they're more talented on the offensive line. They would say that that last year, the locker room, the offensive line room was such a cancer in terms of chemistry, working together. And a lot of that comes through in offensive line play on Sundays. And they say that's going to be better, much better this year. So we'll see if that method works for them. Less talent, hopefully more cohesiveness on the offensive line. That'll be a huge thing to watch for the Texans. Indianapolis Colts, where we have the Daniel Jones versus Anthony Richardson battle brewing. Hopefully we'll get Anthony Richardson back healthy in camp to battle for the job. Jack, go ahead on the Colts offensive environment.
Yeah, the good news for Indianapolis is that they have a good schedule. They play in a dome. They have 11 games inside this year. Obviously, a big part of that is that their home stadium is a dome, and that Shane Steichen has typically led above average in pace offenses. The big thing for Indianapolis is we have them 15th in concentration. If we wanted to get a little more granular here, I think this is one where it would be helpful to think about it by position, because at wide receiver they have a lot of competition. They have Josh Downs, they have Pittman, they have Alec Pierce, they have Adonai Mitchell. So those guys are all going to be rotating for snaps and pushing each other for snaps, routes, and targets. But at running back, we know Jonathan Taylor is going to be a workhorse. They drafted Tyler Warren in the first round. We expect him to be a full-time tight end right from the get-go. So the running back and the tight end room are very concentrated. The wide receiver room is a little bit more spread out. So on the whole, we have them 15th. And then this is not the same offensive line that the Colts used to have 3 or 4 years ago. Thorne has them 23rd. On the whole, we don't have Indianapolis as excellent in really anything. We have them 6th in weather, which is their highest rated category. We don't have them any lower than 23rd, which is offensive line. And they kind of just net out to be pretty average. We have them 14th in tier 3.
All right, near the top here of tier 3 for the Indianapolis Colts. Yeah, I mean, offensive line play used to be like the hallmark of the Browns and the Colts. Like every year they show up and these guys have awesome offensive lines. They're both getting dinged pretty hard here this season, coming into the year, at least for Browns and Colts. Offensive line play, certainly something to watch there, as Daniel Jones has not been good under pressure in his career should he win the job. Jacksonville Jaguars, a lot of changes for Jacksonville here. You get the Travis Hunter stuff, and you get Liam Cohen coming over, going to call plays here as the head coach. Mark, go ahead on Jacksonville Jaguars.
Another team here I really wanted to be higher kind of coming into this exercise, and they ended up quite a bit lower than I was anticipating. As you mentioned, they get Liam Cohen as the head coach here after just an elite offensive that he orchestrated in Tampa Bay last season. But, there are some, I think, question marks of an elite offensive coordinator now changing teams and becoming head coach in a new situation. So I think we dinged him a couple spots there just with taking on some more responsibility there. His sole focus won't be on drawing up offensive game plans for the upcoming week. And then drafting Travis Hunter here, number 2 overall, that's exciting as well. But we aren't even sure at this point in the offseason how much offense he's really going to play. So Brian Thomas is kind of the one you key in on here as a massive rookie hit last year. We certainly love us some Brian Thomas, but kind of looking down the rest of the pecking order, it should be a competition at wide receiver 3 between De'Ami Brown and Parker Washington there. And then Brenton Strange is going to step into the tight end hole left by Evan Ingram and his departure to Denver. And while, Brenton Strange should get some solid targets, we're not necessarily sure on his talent all just yet. And then looking at this backfield too, it's quite a bit of a mess as of right now with Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, and Bashal Tutin all competing for touches there. So Jacksonville also ranks 32nd in offensive line, dead last in the NFL for Brandon Thorne. A huge ding there. When you look at Liam Cohen's offense last year, the Tampa Bay offensive line was in the elite tier for Thorne all season long. So coming to Jacksonville, where that's a huge question mark, I think is a downgrade as well. So Jacksonville comes in 26th overall for us, clinging on to tier 4 there, the back end of tier 4. But yeah, not a great overall environment here for the Jaguars, despite all the off-season optimism.
Yeah, and the running back thing dings them on concentration. I'd love to see one of those guys emerge. I just don't know that it's going to happen there. My bet right now remains on Travis Etienne to open the year as the starter, but it's going to be a battle. And I think all these guys are going to be battling through training camp and through the regular season, which makes it tough from a concentration standpoint there for sure. Chiefs, annually, seemingly one of the best offensive environments. However, last couple of years have been a somewhat, how shall I say, mediocre, I guess, for a lot of players on the Chiefs. Jack, go ahead on their outlook for 2025.
Yeah, we have Andy Reid first in our offensive coordinator faith. He's just been doing it at an elite level for so long that we felt it was right to put him up there. I think offensive line is one that people are going to have a lot of questions about after how their season ended last year. Obviously, they have two studs in the interior with Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith, and the outside offensive line was a big question mark last year. But Thorne has them 13th going into 2025. Andy Reid has typically engineered above average pace teams. Not He hasn't been in the upper echelon a lot, but his teams have typically been above average in plays per game, and we're projecting that again this year. Schedule and weather, we have them below average. They play outdoors in Kansas City in November and December, so not ideal. And then concentration is a tricky one because the past couple of years we've really seen them rotate their wide receivers. They could do that again this year, but if Rashee Rice is healthy and not suspended, they have three clear top three receivers in Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, and Hollywood Brown. And then after that, you get into guys like Juju, Jalen Royals, Sky Moore. So if there's a time to condense the wide receiver snaps and routes, this is kind of the personnel to do it with. And then after the original reports on Travis Kelce early in the offseason were that maybe he's going to serve more of a mentorship role this year and they're going to get Noah Gray more snaps. The recent stuff has been that they're still going to ride Kelce. Just like they have the past couple of years. And then Pacheco coming back healthy seems like he's going to be reassuming the RB1 role. So on the whole, we have the Chiefs 19th in concentration, but it could go a number of directions depending on what they do with Kelce and whether they do end up condensing those wide receiver snaps around the top three guys. But on the whole, with the above average pace, with the faith we have in Andy Reid and Thorne projecting an offensive line improvement, we have the Chiefs 7th overall coming in tier 2.
Yeah, and I will note, Thorne's going to have fuller rankings and notes on the offensive line coming up in the draft kit in probably a month or so. The kid they drafted, I believe his name is Josh Simmons, was not supposed to be, like, the rhetoric around him around draft was he was not going to be ready for training camp, not going to be ready for week one. There was optimism that he might actually be ready for week one, which would be an even bigger boost to their offensive line. And I agree with you in terms of concentration. Like, maybe they were rotating wide receivers so much because they didn't have anyone. Now you can play on every single play. Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, and Hollywood Brown. That's what I would do. I would stop messing around with dusty Justin Watson, and they were giving like Sky Moore routes and all this other nonsense. Just run those three guys, and there's some chance that they do that. So I think there's even room to grow here on the Chiefs, but I like where we have him here in the great tier. Los Angeles Rams, very close last year to unseating the Eagles, who ended up being clearly the best team in the NFL. Mark, go ahead on the Rams for 2025.
Rams are a team that it's pretty hard to find many warts in their offensive environment. They're, middle of the pack in offensive line, which is about as bad of a thing as you can say about a Sean McVay-led offense. Adding Devontae Adams in the offseason should really help keep this volume heavily condensed onto Adams. Obviously, Puka Nacua there as the presumed wide receiver one. And then while they did add some more competition in the backfield, we still think Kyren Williams is more than likely to be the workhorse in this backfield. So, high volume concentration of touches here for the Rams. Obviously, they play their games in LA indoors, so that's a boon for them for schedule and weather. And then kind of looking at the fantasy playoffs, which were some tiebreakers for us on teams that were close in schedule and weather. They play versus Detroit, at Seattle, at Atlanta in the fantasy playoffs. Obviously, those Detroit and Atlanta games should be filled with fantasy goodness. So a lot of good things to say here about the Rams. They ended up landing 3rd overall for us, clearly in tier 1 for the Sean McVay-led Los Angeles Rams.
Yeah, love it. And I mean, one thing you get with McVay is you typically know who's going to be on the field. They play their tight ends, and I'm not sure they're going to do it this year with Ferguson and Higbee, but historically, they have played 100% of the snaps, the starting tight end. They have played the same 3 wide receivers. They have used the same base back on almost every play. And so you get a lot of predictability in there. And when your offense is efficient, like Sean McVay offenses typically are, that's just incredibly valuable. And obviously, Devontae Adams is going to make it concentrate even more here among those two guys. Expect Tutu Atwell to be the 3rd wide receiver. But yeah, love having the Rams here in tier 1. Chargers. Extremely run heavy. At least that was the narrative around the Chargers. Extremely run heavy under Greg Roman and Harbaugh, presumed boomers. Jack, go ahead on Chargers for 2025.
Yeah, they started really run heavy in the first month, but then they kind of transitioned to being above average from a pass rate standpoint. But on the other stuff, they were 29th in plays per game last year. The three teams below them were the Jets, Panthers, and Jaguars, three pretty inept offenses. So for the Chargers to rank that low, despite being a pretty solid offense, doesn't bode well. Just from a pace perspective, Greg Roman has actually engineered some all right offenses, but he's also had Lamar Jackson and Justin Herbert. So we were pretty low on him. We have Roman 23rd in our offensive coordinator faith. The Thorne does have the Chargers O-line 10th. That was their best attribute. They do have some nice weather playing in LA, obviously. And then from a concentration standpoint, Lad McConkey's the clear wide receiver one, but beyond that, it's kind of a mess. They've got Will Dissly, they've got Tyler Conklin at tight end. They've got Gadsden at tight end too, and then at running back they've got Najee Harris and Omarion Hampton competing for RB1 duties. So we had them pretty much below average across the board, except for weather and offensive line. And in total, they landed 24th in tier 4.
Yeah, and like I don't want people to take this as a knock on Lad McConkey, but behind McConkey, it's not very concentrated, right? I'm not sure Omarion Hampton's going to run away from Najee Harris. In fact, I don't really think that he will. And as Jack mentioned, I'm expecting a full competition between Trey Harris, Mike Williams, and Quentin Johnston for routes and snaps behind McConkey there. Las Vegas Raiders. Mark, I feel like one of the biggest differences between public perception and betting markets right now is Raiders offense. Implied team total on the Raiders this year is very, very low, even though they have two players going the first 15 picks of fantasy in Genty and Bowers. And I think they get, pretty stable / average to above average quarterback play from Geno Smith. And they get Chip Kelly, notorious for running a lot of plays per game. So what do you think about offensive environment here on the Raiders this year?
It's an exciting team to talk through and dream on for sure. You kind of laid out the blueprint there for a really exciting offense. They are really high for us in volume concentration. You obviously get Brock Bowers at tight end, Jacoby Myers at wide receiver, and then Ashton Genty in the backfield. Those three players should handle a vast majority of the touches for the Raiders this year. After that, it's a bit more of a question mark with them drafting Jack Besh. There's some hype around Dante Thornton on the outside, like maybe he takes some snaps there in Vegas. So behind them, it's tough, but certainly the top end concentration is there for Vegas. I think the thing really keeping them down, and this is kind of, again, like what we talked about with Houston last year, is like the offensive line just really hampered their offensive capability of being strong last year. And right now, Vegas comes in at 25th overall. So that kind of is what keeps Vegas in the middle of the pack offensively for us. Otherwise, I think they'd be top 10 and in tier 2. But with that offensive line concern there, they come in at 15th in tier 3 for us. And yeah, there's definitely some optimism with Chip Kelly. We've seen him run very fast-paced offenses in the past. So, I think there's certainly some room for Vegas to climb here, but I think the offensive line here is the biggest wart that they'll have to overcome.
Yeah, for sure. And I could see them being higher in pace. We have them 9th in pace. I could see them if they're good, right? Like if they can execute what Chip Kelly wants to do, I could see them playing even faster than that. But, Chip Kelly flamed out pretty hard with the Eagles there. Oh, that was a long time ago, but we'll see. I'm excited to see what the Raiders do because, again, big discrepancy, I think, between public perception and the betting markets right now.
I think, too, there's going to be a wide range of outcomes here just with new head coach, new offensive coordinator, new quarterback. There's not that much established here for the Raiders to grow off of. It's, going to be a lot of voices and opinions kind of having to come together as the season goes along.
Yep. All right. Miami Dolphins. My God, Jack, they're all over my brother, Mike McDaniel. Oh, they're killing him. They want him fired. They say they've had enough of Mike McDaniel. How fast things turn. What do you think about Dolphins' offensive environment for 2025?
Yeah, we kind of had the Dolphins as a similar story as the Raiders, where we had their offensive line 26th, but everything else was pretty solid across the board. We still had McDaniel 11th. Obviously, last year was rough, but he also had a lot of external factors with Tua's injury to deal with last year. And then from a concentration standpoint, in previous years prior to 2024, we'd really seen the passing offense be condensed around Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Last year, it kind of opened up a bit with Jonnu Smith and Achane, but it was still really condensed around those four. And And from a pace standpoint, we've got them pretty average. They do have some tough weather games just within their division, going with Buffalo, New England, and New York. But playing home games in Miami helps with that a bunch. So we've got them 11th in schedule and 17th in weather. On the whole, the 26th offensive line ranking drags them down, but they still land 11th in Tier 2.
Yeah. 11th in Tier 2, yes. So, I would agree that Mike McDaniel did not do a good job handling Tua's injury last year, right? I will certainly concede that. When Tua's been out there, they have had some crazy efficient seasons. I mean, Tua's gone over 4,000 yards, and a lot of that, as Jack said, was going to two guys. It was a bit scary last year to see McDaniel scheming stuff to Jonnu Smith instead of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, which concerned me from a concentration standpoint. But similar to the Packers, I'm not sure what happened last year is really that reflective of what they wanted to do. So, yeah, I like being a bit higher than market here on Dolphins' offensive environment. Minnesota Vikings here. We've seen them do it with a lot of dusty quarterbacks before, Mark. Now we're going to see if they can do it with J.J. McCarthy in his first career NFL season. What do you think about Vikings?
Yeah, I mean, when you drop an offensive environment to put someone in, the Minnesota Vikings, I think clearly rise to the top here with Kevin O'Connell in charge, and that's where the Vikings end up for us. They're second overall for us in Tier 1. Kind of when we were doing this, and the Falcons, they're basically 0.2 points behind the Falcons. So if you really wanted, you could put Minnesota first overall, and I think that would be fair. Certainly, they have a tough schedule this season again, as we've hit on with the NFC North. Otherwise, not really many holes to poke at all here. Kevin O'Connell, I think, is easily a top 3 to 5 offensive coordinator in the league right now. Their offensive line up to 5th overall right now, I think, is massive. JJ McCarthy just in pretty much the best situation possible here in the NFL. Home games in a dome there in Minnesota, and then target concentration here is really tight amongst Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and TJ Hawkinson. In the backfield, we do get a little bit more competition this year for Aaron Jones as they signed Jordan Mason from the 49ers. But overall, man, there's really just not many holes to poke here in Minnesota. I think second in Tier 1 is very fair for the Vikings.
Oh, for sure. I mean, God, I've played Nick Mullins in DFS. I've had a Kia on Josh Dobbs, and it's worked out well. I mean, imagine saying that. And that just speaks to me to the offensive environment that the Vikings have created. New England Patriots here. Jack, I think everybody has optimism around Drake May. However, you could certainly poke a lot of holes in the environment. Go ahead on Patriots.
Yeah, and poke holes in the environment, I will do. I'll start with the good. We have them second in schedule. That's mostly from a winning games perspective. Their strength of schedule is pretty good. Beyond that, it's really rough. Their next highest rated category is pace, and we have them 20th. Weather, we have them 31st. Their offensive line, we have 24th. OC Faith, 24th. In concentration, we have them dead last. They have Ramondre Stevenson and Travion Henderson duking it out for starting running back duties. Stephon Diggs is coming off a torn ACL. We think he'll be the wide receiver 1 when he's healthy, but we don't know exactly when he'll be healthy or we don't know when he'll play, and we don't know when he'll be 100%. And beyond him, Demario Douglas, Kyle Williams are going to be competing and are the presumed wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. But they also have Kayshon Boutte, who played well last year. They have Mac Hollins, who's a really good blocking wide receiver and actually played snaps for the Bills last year. Jalen Polk is 1 year removed from getting second-round draft capital. He was maybe the worst wide receiver in the entire league last year, but after 1 year, can you completely write him off? I don't know. Kendrick Bourne is a cut candidate, but he's still on their roster too. And then they play 2 tight ends as well with Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper at times. So it's just really rough. This is actually the first team we have in the UGG category. We have them not dead last. We have them 31st, though.
Yes, 31st. Stay tuned to see who is the dead last offensive environment. Yeah, I want to be careful, at least for me personally. Their weaponry is better. The Patriots' offensive line is better. It doesn't mean that it's good, And so, I'm excited about Drake May. He averaged over 16 DraftKings points per game last year with the stone cold worst offensive line and worst weaponry. Again, I think it's better, but that does not mean if I think that I think that it's good. So yeah, down here in the UGG category for the Patriots, and certainly weather is a factor in some of those games late in the year up there in New England and Buffalo and the AFC East. Let's go to the New Orleans Saints, another team that appears to be rebuilding, or one of the teams that appears to be in full-blown rebuild mode after a long time of trying to kick the can down the road since Drew Brees' retirement. Mark, go ahead on the offensive environment, though, for the Saints.
I've had a couple teams that I was surprised at how low we were on Houston and Jacksonville, and then this one is opposite end of the spectrum. Very, very surprised by kind of where we ended up on the Saints here after going through this process. We have them in tier 1, 4th overall. As a little spoiler alert there, but the Saints have one of the league's easiest schedules this season. They play 10 dome games. They obviously are, matched up in the NFC South, as we have alluded to a few times, sets up as kind of like a shootout division there. Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Alvin Kamara, should take up the vast majority of the opportunities here when healthy. So the concentration of volume should be tight for those three, and those three players are all highly skilled and talented as well. When we went on this ETR retreat, we were kind of I was chatting with Jack about how he feels about our projections, and we were talking about the Saints, and we feel really good about where we are on Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. Like, if this team has competent QB play at all, which is a massive question mark, obviously at this point, I think this offense is ready to kind of explode for fantasy purposes. The OL, the offensive line, is a bit of a concern here, kind of middle of the pack at 18th. Not amazing, but not a huge weakness either. They obviously spent their first round overall pick on an offensive lineman there, hoping to shore up that position. And then Kellen Moore's calling card has always been pace and plays run for his offenses. So, while the Saints might not be the most efficient offense, we do have some confidence that Kellen Moore is going to try and push the pace and get plenty of plays out there for the Saints. So, kind of the QB agnostic offensive environment rating leaves the Saints really high here. Again, 4th overall, tier 1 for us.
Yeah. And I mean, like, quarterback play, as Mark said, is going to be a huge factor here, but I've been taking Olave ahead of ADP. I've been taking Rashid Shaheed ahead of ADP. I mix in some Juwan Johnson stuff. It's risky because if the quarterback play goes bad, it could be really bad here, but they are set up from an offensive environment standpoint to be a really, really interesting team and get into some shootouts there in the dome with these other AFC South teams that are kind of similar in terms of environment, maybe some struggling defenses, etc. So yeah, I like taking Saints stuff right now. I understand the bet that I'm making, though, on the quarterback play evening out, with likely Tyler Shuck starting most of the season. New York Football Giants. Brian Daboll is back, saved his job somehow heading into this year. Jack, go ahead on the New York Giants.
Yeah, we mentioned that the Patriots were 31st. We're not making you guys wait long for number 32. It will be the Giants. We have them 30th in offensive coordinator faith, as you mentioned, with Brian Daboll somehow saving his job. 30th on the O-line, last in schedule. They have a brutal division with the Eagles, Commanders, and Cowboys. They are fairly slow-paced. The good news if you want to find good news with the Giants, it's that they are fairly concentrated, at least target-wise, with Malik Neighbors getting a 33% target share. That's the best of the past 4 years. And then Wan'Dale Robinson got plenty of targets last year too, and Theo Johnson really seemed to win the tight end one role over the second half of his rookie season. Running back is obviously a question mark, and why they're not higher. They've got Tyrone Tracy and Cam Scadaboo competing for RB1 duties, but the targets at least should be fairly concentrated. Despite us ranking them 11th in volume concentration, that's not enough to save them from the dead last ranking. They are in tier 6, the UG tier at 32nd.
Yeah, I mean, the strength of this team to me is going to be the pass rush. They have a really, really good defensive line. It does not necessarily help their offensive environment, but they're going to get after the quarterback when they are on defense. And I think that's going to be the kind of the way they try to win games. Hey, let's pressure the quarterback, not give up a lot of points here, try to win some games that way. Likely see Jackson Dart if/when Russ Wilson is proven not to be the answer here. But yes, dead last in offensive environment, New York Football Giants. Philadelphia Eagles, Mark, certainly concentration here is one feather in the cap of the Eagles. Go ahead on their offensive environment.
Philly's another team that if the offensive coordinator stayed the same, similar to the Detroit Lions, they'd be in tier 1 for us. I think Kellen Moore leaving and going to New Orleans and bringing in, a new offensive coordinator here for the Eagles is enough to just knock them down right outside of tier 1. They land 6 overall for us in tier 2. They're still Thorne's top ranked offensive line. They've just been a perennial stalwart there on the offensive line with Jeff Stoutland at the helm in Philly. They also are the most concentrated team in the NFL for us volume-wise there, with Saquon Barkley, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, and Dallas Goedert taking up a vast majority of the targets and rushing attempts for the Eagles. It's hard to know how their pace will be impacted by the new offensive coordinator. Again, Kellen Moore, was really strong paced team in LA and as well as Philly there. So we think that might take a little bit of a step back, but the being first overall in offensive line and volume concentration has Philly up quite high for us. Again, 6 overall in tier 2.
Yeah, I mean, offensive line play and concentration to me is just like so huge for the Eagles. They only really throw to 2 of their wide receivers. They barely use backs behind Saquon Barkley. Goddard's going to be out there a ton, and they're going to be super efficient, thanks largely to scheme and offensive line play. So, yeah, certainly think Eagles are one of the best offensive environments. I skipped over the New York Jets, Jack, because I don't know my alphabet. So let's go back to the New York Jets here. Can't be worse in terms of play calling, in terms of offensive coordinator stuff. Tanner Engstrand comes over from the Lions, which I thought was a big boost. Now, we don't have a good ranking at all on Tanner Engstrand. It's just really volatile what's going to happen here. I don't think a lot of people know a lot about him, but yeah, go ahead on Jets for 2025.
Yeah, I thought you skipped over the Jets because you thought I was just doing such a good job with the UG tier that you had to give them to me. No, but we have the Jets 30th. We have Tanner Engstrand 32nd in offensive coordinator faith. That obviously has a lot more room to rise than it does to land around that area with a new offensive coordinator. I thought it was a little suspicious that the Lions decided to go out of house with John Morton rather than hiring Engstrand, who would have been kind of the presumptive Ben Johnson replacement, I thought. Concentration for the Jets is another interesting one where, like, Garrett Wilson, we know, is going to command an absolutely massive target share. But beyond them, they've got Josh Reynolds. They've got Alan Lazard. Somehow still, they've got Malachi Corley, who was just a day 2 pick last year at running back. We think they might play at least 2 running backs, maybe 3 if Isaiah Davis gets involved, along with Breece Hall and Braylon Allen. And then Mason Taylor is the presumptive tight end one, but he still has to actually win that role. We think this will probably be a lower plays per game team. We have them 28th in pace, and then Thorne ranked them 19th in offensive line. The weather in New York in the winter is not ideal. We have it 26th in weather. When you put all this together, we have the Jets in the UG tier at 30th.
Yeah, I don't disagree that they're in the UG tier. It's not a great environment. I probably have a little bit more faith in Engstrom, but yeah, I mean, you can't argue that the environment is not good for the Jets. I will say, it doesn't really matter what the environment is if Justin Fields is just tucking and running. And my most owned quarterback so far in the best ball streets is indeed Justin Fields here, who I could see him running for 800, 900 yards, which is just outrageous for someone who's going 100th overall right now, roughly, in drafts. Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, our old friend, Arthur Smith. This is kind of how this exercise got started. I wanted the sticky notes on my computer for not drafting anyone attached to Hackett or Arthur Smith or fraudulent or anything like that. I'm glad to see, Mark, that we do have OC faith on the Steelers here at 29th in the league. Go ahead on the Steelers.
Yeah, and again, these are fantasy-oriented rankings for us. We're trying to get the best offensive environments for fantasy football, and Arthur Smith has not been very conducive to that over the years, so he does land in the bottom 5 there of offensive coordinator faith for us. And there's really not a whole lot to love here overall on Pittsburgh. The schedule and weather, once again, very tough in AFC North. They also, kind of just have a middle-of-the-pack offensive line, 16th overall. Again, low in offensive coordinator faith for us, and then low in concentration as well. They have DK Metcalf on the outside at wide receiver, but behind that, it's pretty much, Pat Freiermuth would be, I think, second in line for targets. The rest of the wide receivers there are pretty suspect. They're expecting a leap from Roman Wilson, who barely played at all in his rookie season, and then Calvin Austin has been dubbed the wide receiver 2, which is a pretty lackluster thing to say there. And just with Arthur Smith, we've seen like Van Jefferson out there just running routes, over the years, and it's not very conducive to much targets going to the wide receivers there. So Pittsburgh is pretty low for us here, as you could imagine, 29th overall in tier 5 for us.
Yes, the dusty tier for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And that's all, not to get caught up on the George Pickens stuff, but that's the other part of like why I'm high on Pickens this year. It's like he was decent, had some explosive games for Pittsburgh. Now he gets in, to me, one of the better passing spots in the NFL here with the Cowboys. And so, yeah, just guys that are leaving Pittsburgh, I find to be at least somewhat interesting, especially in the pass game here. Seattle Seahawks make the quarterback change, going from Geno Smith to Sam Darnold. Jack, go ahead on Seattle.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because they seem to want to undergo a complete offensive philosophy change from where they were last year. There was an article in The Athletic earlier in the offseason about how they want to embrace a wide zone run scheme. They want to bulk up the offensive line. They want to do more 2 tight end stuff, which was a big departure from what they did last year with Ryan Grubb, where they pretty much ran 3 wide receivers on the field at all times. So they brought in Clint Kubiak from New Orleans. He's a tough one to rank because obviously the Saints had 40 plus points in each of their first 2 games, and then the season kind of unraveled with injuries. We have him about average, but if he can regain some of that magic that he gave the Saints those first 2 weeks with everyone healthy, obviously that number could fly up. And despite their desire to run the ball more and have this more 2 tight end heavy set team, Thorne ranked them 28th in offensive line. So they might not have the personnel really to do that at this point. From a concentration standpoint, the targets should be quite concentrated around Jackson Smith and Jigba and Cooper Kupp. Their wide receiver 3 right now is either MVS or Jake Bobo. Running back is not super concentrated given they do play both Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, but we saw when Walker got hurt last year that the targets or the touches really condensed around Charbonnet. So from a contingent value standpoint, that's at least some good knowledge to have. And then tight end is kind of just super up in the air with Noah Fant, Elijah Arroyo. They still have AJ Barner too. So that kind of dings their concentration standpoint. But on the 2 positions we care about most for fantasy at running back and wide receiver, we have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. Schedule and weather, they're pretty close to average, and pace, they're a little bit below average. In total, they don't really stand out in any particular category, but they aren't at the absolute bottom of the league in any category either. We have them 27th overall in tier 5.
Yeah. The only thing that I would say when I think about the Seahawks is Clint Kubiak was cooking before the Saints got injured last year. It was a really small sample. It was like 3 or 4 weeks. But man, the Saints were absolutely on fire with, not the greatest, I would say, personnel. And so that gives me some hope on Seattle, but agree, the overall environment and likeliest outcome here is not great in terms of offensive environment for the Seahawks. San Francisco 49ers. A lot of wildly different opinions out here on the 49ers. Talked a little bit about that on the show with Evan and Tyler a couple weeks back. Mark, go ahead on the 49ers.
A lot of good here still in San Francisco. I would say the major wart for the 49ers is their offensive line, ranked outside the top 20 there for Brandon Thorne. I think a lot of that is buoyed by Trent Williams there. So if anything were to happen to Trent Williams, I think this could probably be a bottom 5 unit in the NFL. Obviously, we have Kyle Shanahan here as one of the top offensive minds in the league. He comes in at, I believe, 3rd overall for us there for San Francisco in terms of offensive coordinator faith. So I have a lot of faith in Shanahan-led offense. And then still, while, we may be a little unsure on whether the targets are going to go to, let's say, Brandon Ayuk or Ricky Pearsall or Juwan Jennings this year, George Kittle, like they have a lot of talented players vying for targets, but we know they're going to be condensed on pretty much those 5 players. Having Christian McCaffrey healthy and back this year as well really just shores up that RB room in terms of volume concentration. So, we expect this offense to be quite condensed and efficient once again here for San Francisco. They land as the last team in tier 1 for us at 5th overall.
Yeah. And do have Shanahan 2nd in the offensive coordinator faith, which I think makes sense. Like, this team is going to move the football. This team is going to run the ball efficiently. We saw them do it even without McCaffrey last year. Garendo gets in there and has some really big games. Jordan Mason was one of the best fantasy running backs for a little stretch there as well when he was getting the feature back job. The system is going to work for the 49ers, and it's going to be relatively condensed. So yes, certainly elite offensive environment for the 49ers. 3 teams left here. Let's go to the Tampa Bay Bucks, who of course lost their offensive coordinator for the second consecutive year here. Jack, go ahead on Bucks.
Yeah, so the best thing about the Bucks is that their offensive line ranks third. Concentration is where they suffer the most. They have Bucky Irving, who is under 200 pounds and probably can't sustain 250 plus touches for his entire career. They also have one of the best pass catching running backs in the entire league in Rachaad White, who could still be there to steal pass catching work. And then the wide receiver position is a huge mess. They have Mike Evans, Chris Godwin. We don't know when he'll be back. We don't know when he'll be fully healthy. They drafted Mika Ibuka in the first round, and they have Jalen McMillan coming off a red-hot end to his rookie season. Cade Otton should be pretty entrenched as the tight end one, but running back and wide receiver, the touches could be pretty divvied up pretty decently. The most interesting category for the Bucs, I think, is the offensive coordinator faith. We ranked them 26th, but the past 2 years, Grizzard has gotten to learn from Dave Canales and Liam Cohen, who have obviously gone on to become head coaches, and he also has a background with Mike McDaniel. So I think that 26th ranking could have some room to rise, and if Grizzard can emulate the magic that Canales and especially Liam Cohen had last year, then they could end up even higher than the 18th overall Tier 3 rank we have them. They do have a first-place schedule, but they also get the benefit of playing the Falcons, Panthers, and Saints twice each, so their schedule's 13th, playing in Tampa. Pretty good for weather. We have them 12th there, and then we have them average in pace.
Yeah, and to me, the big question is concentration, right? We have them 29th in concentration, which I think makes sense given their personnel. What we saw down the stretch last year, though, was like, you know what? Bucky Irving gives us the best chance to win, and we're just going to give him the ball 20-plus times a game. I don't think they're going to do that for the whole season. I agree with Jack. Rachaad White is a major threat to get in there over the course of the whole season. But at some point, if they may not make the playoffs, they're losing, just be like, screw it, man. We're going to play Bucky for every snap. We're going to play Godwin, Evans, and Egbuka on every snap. And then you start to get better concentration here, which would make the rank in terms of offensive environment looks better. But they certainly have a lot of talent here and, of course, very good offensive line. Let's go to the Tennessee Titans, who selected Cam Ward first overall. Mark, go ahead on the Titans.
Titans are an interesting team to talk through this year. You know, they obviously added Cam Ward, number 1 overall. And I think moving on from Will Levis at the quarterback position is going to help his offense look a lot better under Brian Callahan. It just seemed like Levis had really a tough time, distinguishing and picking apart defenses. But this is a QB agnostic ranking, so we'll talk about other aspects of the offense here. Thorne has the Titans 11th ranked offensive line, which is, really solid. They've should take a leap here in year 2 with the resources invested in the offensive line there. Outside of Calvin Ridley, though, not necessarily sure where the targets are going to go in this offense. We have Chig Okonkwo penciled in as a starting tight end, but the secondary wide receiver positions are pretty tough to figure out after investing multiple draft picks there. They still have guys like Treylon Burks kind of waiting in the wings. They signed Tyler Lockett in the offseason, not sure if he's going to be fully dusted or if he could have a bit of a revival this year in Tennessee. So outside of Calvin Ridley, not necessarily sure where the targets are going to go in the passing game. And then in the backfield, it could be a pretty even split between Tyjae Spears and Tony Pollard. Pollard certainly got the lion's share last year, but Spears, was continually banged up, and Pollard had a much healthier season. So with the Titans, they do have an easiest schedule. Otherwise, not really many strengths going on in this group. Nothing inside the top 10 here for the Titans for us outside of the schedule. So they kind of fall into tier 4 for us. 22nd overall are the Titans.
All right. Last team to hit is the Washington Commanders, formerly known as the Washington Football Team. The entire direction of the franchise changed last year when you got Jaden Daniels to play at just an incredible level as a stone cold rookie. Jack, go ahead on the Commanders.
Yeah, Cliff Kingsbury wasted no time getting back to the fast pace that he had during his time with Arizona. The Commanders led the NFL in plays per game last year. We have them first in pace. We also have them 8th in offensive line. So those are their 2 really their best categories. We have Cliff as an above average offensive coordinator as well. The concentration one was one we kind of haggled over a bit because Terry McLaurin is the clear wide receiver one here, but he's never had above a 24% target share in any individual season. And the 6 games before Noah Brown got hurt last year, Noah Brown out-targeted Terry McLaurin 42-38. And then tight end, we don't know if Ben Sinnott is going to push Zach Ertz a little more with Ertz getting up there in age and Sinnott going into year 2. Running back, we have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen with Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler leading the way. But even at times last year, there were times when Chris Rodriguez and Jeremy McNichols would randomly get snaps. So we have them 18th in volume concentration. And given the fact that we know the 2 running backs and pretty much the 3 wide receivers who are going to be out there a lot for the Commanders, we thought that was fair. Overall, they rank 8th in tier 2 on the backs of their high pace, their league leading pace, and a top 10 offensive line.
Yeah. Pains me to say it, man, but Cliff did a great job last year, and like the way I started this offensive coordinator stuff as, half joking, half serious. Obviously, it's really hard to get data and contextualize exactly each offensive coordinator's strength. I thought Cliff did a really bad job at different times in his career. Got to say, he did a great job last season, and we do have 14th out of 32 offensive coordinator ranked there on Cliff in terms of offensive coordinator faith. So there you have it. Hopefully you're watching on YouTube where you can see our elite tier of offensive environments. Great, solid, meh, dusty, and UGG tier. If you'd like to get a look at our actual fantasy rankings and how all this stuff flows through to fantasy rankings, you can always check out our rankings as part of the Best Ball or Draft Kit Pro products. For Mark, for Jack, producer Ryan, for producer Luke, I'm Adam. Good luck, everybody.